This series that we're starting, this I'm Not That. Spiritual refugees in search of home. We've talked about this term, we've bandied it around, tossed it around over the years, this unique community that we have here in 1111, this often thinking of ourselves as sort of spiritual refugees in a lot of ways. We're not that kind of Christian. We're spiritual but not religious. Perhaps we're none of the above. Perhaps some of us are sort of agnostic, even atheist. We're not sure. We've been a very mixed community over the years. And it's occurred to me as we move into this fall season and into my third year here that kind of coming to an understanding of what it means to be a refugee may be at hand. Maybe that's something we need to pursue. Maybe something we need to explore. And so I have this series that I wanted to play with you with to kind of engage you in for the next 5 weeks. So I want you to look at this at the top of your bulletin. You know, this is not scientific. This is not formal. It's just immediate response sort of thing. Not going to ask for a show of hands. Certainly not going to ask you to bow your heads. But here's what I'd like you to do. Take a look. Which of these best describes you? Maybe at this point in your life. Good music. That's right. That's right. We don't know how to turn that phone off. So take a look at this and just take a look. Which one describes you most? Just immediately look down it and own it for a second. And of course, I will say that these are common responses that the Pew Research Foundation did when it did its religious study a couple of years ago in 2013 and came up with its latest findings on religious trends in America. But the one that's different, that's not on the Pew Foundation one, is it says Christian, but I put in parentheses, not that kind of Christian. And I did that for a couple of reasons, because I've talked with a lot of you. And many of you know my own story, that when my brother would often introduce us to his friends for years, Linda and I both being ministers, he would often say, this is my brother Tom and his wife Linda, my sister-in-law, and they're ministers, but they're not that kind of minister. And so I thought, well, I think probably some of us would feel comfortable saying, we're Christian, but we're not that kind of Christian. But then I realized you could say that both directions, right? Because no matter where you are on that spectrum of right to left, you might say, I'm not that kind of Christian, or I'm not that kind of Christian. We're going to wait for the phone. We're going to figure this phone out. Yeah. There's a button to turn it off. Yeah. You know, I say that because I forgot to turn mine off, and my duck's going to quack in the middle of the service. So I just want you to know I understand completely because I left the duck on. The Pew Research has made suggestions over the last couple of years that religious trends have gone to where young adults, middle young adults, and even older adults are less and less going to church. There's just a decrease in attendance overall. Now, that doesn't really speak to First United Methodist. Our Sunday this morning seems a little bit low, but in general, First Methodist is a growing church. It's been a dynamic church. It's been an open church. It's been an affirming and curious church with a lot of sort of a big tent approach and understanding of how we look at faith. And it's very unique in that regard. So in a sense, I don't want to sort of throw stones at the walls of this structure, because as even a traditional institution, it's quite non-traditional. It's quite unorthodox in many ways. And yet, there's something about this trend that says something about us as well, I think. How did we get here? I'm reading a new book by Krista Tippett. You know, you guys, a lot of you know how much I love Krista Tippett. A lot of you love Krista Tippett. She's the host of On Being every week, the weekly talk show where she interviews people from all around the world, everything from scientists to authors to religious figures, and just deeply moving kinds of dialogues. She has a new book out, came out last year, called Becoming Wise. And in the book, she shares a lot of her interviews. But one of the things she talks about, of course, is like her own story, like she does with all of her interviews. If you've listened, she always starts her interviews off with, like, tell me something about your religious upbringing, of the context of your religious faith, whether you had one or not. And sometimes they share stories that are like, well, I didn't really have that upbringing, but I have this profound sense that there's meaning in life. And then others are, I was raised a conservative evangelical Baptist, and they talk about that. But in the book, she says that no matter what your background, you bring to your reality, to this present, these huge narrative frameworks that we live in the midst of. Sometimes we challenge them. Sometimes we live in opposition to them. Sometimes we live without giving them much thought at all. But we live in the context of these huge narrative frameworks. And she spoke of her own as having these large figures in her life. Her father, who was a fundamentalist evangelical Bible-thumping fire and brimstone preacher who had this odd quality of, in spite of how rigid he was, literally very rigid with her, that in spite of that, he also spoke contradictory almost of this God who is all love. But he practiced it too. So she lived with this paradoxical reality of being in this strict narrative with this message of unbounded love. And she said it was probably that contradiction that sent her on her journey of exploring who she is. I think of my own background, which I've shared in here before, but my own background of growing up in Episcopal church with not much attendance. We went once or twice a year. Growing up as a kid, my father was he was Irish Catholic, came over from Ireland. My mother was background Episcopal, so the Episcopal church was sort of like a compromise, but we didn't attend except on the two major holy days of the season, Easter and Christmas. And so I didn't have a whole lot of rootedness. What I did have rootedness in was two large narratives that framed my life. One was my grandfather, who was a doctor, a surgeon here in Fort Worth, was in the old Medical Arts building that's now the Burnett Park area and complex. And he was a surgeon, and he was one of these formal kinds of surgeons that also had this paradoxical hominess about him. Of course, he made home visits and such back in the day, but he also worked with the railroad companies, and he gave his time to them for free. He had this generous spirit about him that was huge. And even in how he dealt with us, I've often joked that he had sort of a old school, farm school kind of playfulness about him, that if you ever said that you were sick and you didn't want to go to school, he'd say, well, then I'm going to come over, you're going to need an enema. And that was all it took, because an enema would cure everything. If any of you are old school enough to remember that, you remembered, well, an apple a day and also will keep your doctor away. So I had this sense of this generous, sort of playful, fun, earthy, and he loved ranching, and he loved the farm, and I'd go out with him and work on the ranch. This big sort of generous presence, but very quiet and humble about him. And in one sense, I didn't get to know him except by his behavior. It's the only way I reflect and know him now, because he was a man of few words. And the other side of my life was this big, as far as father figures, was my own father, who was also a very large, imposing presence, but for a completely different reason. He was entirely self-focused, overly self-focused. And I suspect that part of that was his own Irish Catholic background, his own upbringing, the tension in his own family being in Ireland, as well as the Irish guilt that was laid upon him because of the dynamics between his father and his mother, and their background, Protestant and Catholic, all that shame, all that religious baggage that he then brought to his childhood, and then which found its expression in this incompleteness, in this need to be big, but totally empty. It's interesting, Krista Tippett talks about how before she started doing this show many years ago, she was a journalist, and she worked for Time magazine, she worked for The New Yorker, she worked for all sorts of major magazines, but she was involved in Europe and in the UN, and she said she was involved at a time when she was surrounded by people with huge narratives. She was working with generals and commanders in chief and State Department people, all of them formulating issues around the nuclear arms race. And so she would be in the presence of these people who had huge ideas about dealing with potentially global destructive possibilities, so that they were huge on the outside. She said she'd never been in the presence of such genius on the outside until after a while she recognized in the midst of all of that gigantic hugeness outside, she said their inside was so tiny and withdrawn. It was so shriveled up. They had no inner life. Their life was all outer life. Well, that's easy to understand, but the juxtaposition of that was so obvious to her that it sent her on this quest of trying to find out what in the United States, for example, what in the Western world is preoccupied with this idea of how big our outside lives are, such to the effect that we avoid or we miss our inner lives altogether. And that's what I think we have to face when we're dealing with this particular text and when we're dealing with what it means to be the church. Because I think the church sometimes, like traditional faith, like many faiths, gets caught up in the outside and completely overlooks the inner life. And that happens at our peril, I think. As the monologue really illustrated so well. We miss being the church while we're trying to be the church. We completely overshoot it because we're caught up in the outside and forget the inner life. I myself, of course, had that experience of coming to faith like maybe some of you did through the evangelical route. I didn't grow up in the church. I didn't grow up Catholic, as I mentioned, but I found faith as a teenager, as a preteen, because I grew up in this big sort of dichotomous opposites kind of reality where I had this narcissistic reality, and then I had my grandfather who unfortunately didn't get to be together with enough as a child. So I was raised in this superficial reality of it's all the outward story, and that was so thin itself. And so I went looking. I talked about the sign we wear, right? The sign all of us wear that says, "Love me." We all wear this sign, right? So I went looking for that. And I found it at a Baptist church. I found it with a number of friends from high school who had the answer. And that's, of course, what I was looking for, was the answer. And so I went to them, to this Baptist church. And it was a huge double wide out in Everman. And the preacher was at one end, and it was a typical revival. And they were singing, and it had gone on for an hour or two. And then the singing at the end was in the 55th verse of "Just As I Am." And I was in my pew, standing and singing. I'd finally figured out the melody at that point and was singing along with everybody else. And then the woman taps me on the shoulder, because there's people walking down to the front, right? They're walking down to the front, and they're crying, and they're sort of in an emotional state, and the preacher's talking. This woman says, "Young man," I suppose because I had long hair at the time. I'm not sure why she thought I needed to, but she said, "Wouldn't you like to go down to the front?" And I said, "No, I'm fine standing right here," And so I keep singing, but she kept persisting, and the friends around her were smiling, and everyone encouraging me to go down to the front. And so I finally succumbed, and they were all so friendly about it. I went down to the front, and we all knelt, and as I looked, while they continued to sing, as I looked, the preacher was going to each one of them, and some of them were crying, and I thought, I got nothing to cry about. I don't know what to say. And when he finally came to me and said, "Young man, why are you here?" I froze. My mind was racing. I couldn't think of why was I here. And I stood up and said, "Because she told me to come down here." Which was true. And so the preacher talked to me for a little bit after the service. And of course, I accepted Jesus into my heart and, became a Christian. And everything, of course, went fine, I suppose, until I realized that once again, there was all this outer life that had no substance or meaning with what was really going on in the inside. And for some of us, that comes pretty quickly. For me, it took a while for me to figure out this disconnect. But eventually, it sort of occurred to me there was an inconsistency in this idea of this big love and yet this exclusiveness that seemed to be present. I love the text right here. We miss it, but I love it. The beginning of the text, look at this. This is one of these great texts that we always say is all about God loves the people on the periphery. God loves the people who are excluded. That's who God's going to, right? It's those people on the outside. We always love to sort of think about those people out there we need to be reaching out to. I love how it starts. By this time, a lot of men and women of doubtful reputation were hanging around Jesus, listening intently. I like this phrase, doubtful reputation, because I'm looking around thinking, there's some doubtful reputations in here. I mean, I'm assuming you're all good people, but I've been proven wrong lots of time. And I'm pretty sure that, doubtful behavior is an equal opportunity employer. You know, you can be the finest looking person in the world. You can be the most successful person in the world, but your inner life could be really waning, could be really lacking and longing. And that, to me, is the hardest thing to get to, I think, to really see. It requires breaking open that shell. I love this idea of being lost, and that what the holy is really trying to look for, is really seeking to connect, is this sense of all of our being lostness. That it's that risky, that valuable to risk things.